Good afternoon, everybody, or morning if you're out in the West Coast. Welcome to the Anatomy of an IP Department Budget webinar hosted by Black Hills IP. Excited to join you today and talk money, everyone's favorite topic. I'm going to turn this over to Tom Marlowe. He's going to be leading the presentation today, and he is the expert on all things IP department budget. Go ahead, Tom.
Hi, thanks, Justin. So I'm going to speak today a little bit about my experience working with colleagues who are and have been in-house heads, and also my own personal experience managing such departments and their budgets. Now, please don't judge, but I really find IP budgets and forecasting an interesting area, and I'll fully own that oddness. For those of you on the line, thank you for sharing in that with me. So let's take a look. So to begin with, let's talk about why understanding the budget matters. What can it impact? For the outside counsel, this is the purse an attorney is paid out of. It determines what you can get paid in a given year or period. Sure, you can go over that number, but your client's going to have to deal with the consequences. And, you know, for my part, I wouldn't want to be the one that causes that. Understanding the budget makeup allows really an understanding of opportunities to provide additional services as well. So if you're providing prosecution services, can an analytics or search services be tied onto that? It gives kind of that opportunity to do additional value-added services. And of course, better knowledge of the client always opens up the potential for better service. I've said that in webinars before, and I guarantee it won't be the last time that I say that. So I do want to make one thing clear. Understanding your client's budget isn't about how to milk the client. As an attorney, not only is this bad business, but there are real ethical boundaries at stake as well. Understanding the client's budget and how the client operates allows an outside attorney to help the client manage that budget, help make decisions that are both smart and budget conscious, and this goes a long way. And for my part, I think that's a real part of what client advocacy is all about. I've done a lot of work in the past with startups, and I can tell you no one is more budget conscious than this group, or at least no one should be more budget conscious than them. It's not uncommon to look at a scenario and see, for example, that filing in, let's say, 10 countries makes sense because their amazing new device will probably be entering each of those markets. Maybe you've heard we have to protect in Japan and Brazil and Canada and so forth. I'm sure you've heard a version of that, but the realities of the business are that such a strategy doesn't make business sense at this point in time because of the costs. So you have to work out a strategy that gets as good a coverage as possible for the available budget. But you can't do that analysis or determine that strategy without an idea of the budget. And that applies to startups as well as large multinational corporations. So if we turn the tables then and look at the other side of this from an in-house or corporate perspective, today's discussion can be used as a framework, data point. These things, the budget categories that I'm going to be talking about are far from one size fits all. The budgets are going to differ by the size of the company, the industry, the business model, and so on. I'll touch on all the high points, and I recommend molding from there, seeing how it compares to current budget setups. From an in-house perspective, the key really is understanding the components of the budget and where your budget's going, working projections next into the mix. From there, it's about alignment with your IP strategy and ultimately the greater business strategy. Also, you have to have an understanding of these components to even be able to, say, turn the knobs as IP in business situations change. I will admit that I can get a little relentless in searching for simplicity, so I may oversimplify some of these categories as we go along. Please feel free to ask questions either during or after the presentation. So let's take a look at the parts of an IP budget. From the top, we'll work our way around the circle. So procurement, this is getting and keeping patents. And don't get this confused with purchasing. This is all about the internal development of the patent portfolio. Next, analytics. There's multiple places where analysis can be required and necessary. When it's outsourced, they've got a cost associated and they'll go on the budget line. M&A, this is with respect to all the support work done for M&A activity. This could be diligence, consultants, analysis, transfer costs, recordation costs, cost to clean up matters fall into that line item. Admin, fairly simple. We're talking about general costs like travel, CLE, tools will be an important one to talk about. Headcount. This is the department's people. There are simple and there are complex ways to track this. When we get to that slide, I'll touch on both of those. And next along the line is internal marketing. This is promoting invention, promoting the use of, say, NDAs, perhaps awards, incentives, contests, prizes, the type of thing that you might do inside a company to keep invention and submitting inventions on the forefront. Litigation, always fun, especially from a budget perspective, throws a twist into everything. We'll be talking about that. And then licensing, in and out licensing. It's worth noting today's discussion is going to be focused on the IP department as a cost center only. In the future, we'll have material where we're going to take a look at the IP department as a P&L, a profit and loss center, but today cost center, so it's a little bit more simplified on the licensing side. And as we go through, don't be surprised if there's items that can overlap categories. The key is when you put the line items within certain categories that it's done consistently. So for example, let's say remuneration, that could live in procurement or it could live in internal marketing. Once you put it somewhere, it should just continue to be tracked in that category. So digging in, we'll begin with procurement. Think of the life cycle of a patent, from the seed of an idea to an issued patent to expiration, all the way through. So you start with the costs associated with the invention disclosure. You might put things like, say, inventor notebooks here, but those could also be dropped into the admin category. With respect to inventor notebooks, it is important for those to be on the budget. It is important for the IP department to own and track those, even though they will technically live with the engineers. Okay, so on your far left top, remuneration. This covers awards and incentives that could be applied to invention submission, filing, issuance. Much of this is custom up to what the business sees as works from an incentive perspective, although there are some potential statutory requirements if you have inventors in Germany, China, Japan, some of these other areas where there are actual statutory requirements that are necessary to follow, some of them avoidable with the right employment agreements in place. I did mention that earlier that remuneration could live here or in the upcoming topic, internal marketing. I like it here because it feels more like a variable cost that is associated with procuring patents. Okay, the next on the list, search. This is either pre-review, so if an invention submission happens and you want to do some prior art search before the patent committee digs into it, pre-review prior art search, or pre-filing for patentability, these types of prior art searches, assuming they're outsourced. And I think that assuming they're outsourced is important to recognize here. For the purposes of a lot of this discussion, we're assuming outsourced costs only. When we get to headcount, I'll get a little bit into how to deal with internal service provision. So then next we've got drafting and filing. This is a big area, and one that's generally pretty easy to track, and also one that's fairly on the top of the list for people to use in forecasting, because you can say, I filed 100 patents last year, we're shooting for 120 this year. I know about how much it costs me to get one filed with the patent office, so I can project what that's going to cost. And it's going to cover all of those upfront costs from getting the application to the attorney and then out the door. One thing to consider here is whether you're on cash or accrual accounting basis to understand the placement of those costs. So for example, if outside counsel has 60 days to draft and file an application once it's given to them, and billings on 30-day terms, that could be a full quarter if you're on cash accounting between when the attorney gets the invention disclosure to when those bills actually hit the books. So something to think about as far as where you want to put the accounting for that budget. So in other words, the inventions that might get approved for filing in October, November, and December might not actually be paid until the following fiscal year or calendar year. Next on the list, we take a look at international filing. This is generally, but doesn't have to be 12 months after the initial filing for direct. If you go PCT routes, you can spin that out a little bit further. The timing here can get complex, and if you want to get really accurate with this, getting an idea of how much international filing or secondary filing you do off of the primary, what routes you generally take, what time frame those decisions are usually made to get an idea where the hits on the budget are going to occur. Then post-filing, we step into prosecution. Prosecution, it's not too difficult to estimate, say, per office action costs for primary and secondary. Those would be your international filings. The tricky part always comes down to timing. How long is it going to take to get to the first office action? It seems like a simple question, but that can generally be one of the trickiest things to figure out, and it's going to differ from technology to technology, from country to country. One of the ways to deal with this is to take a look at historical invoice data, rolling up prosecution billing, pulling out the filings and the annuity data that might be in there. For a group of matters can give you a bit of an idea of what timelines and costs look over time, and then you can use that data to extrapolate projections from there. So it makes things a little bit more complex, but once you have a portfolio of any size, the complexity of the budget comes along with it, because a patent isn't just a single point in time cost. It's something that requires cost over a period of, as little as maybe 1 year up to 5, 6, 7 years, depending on how hard fought it's going to be in the patent office. Of course, in the name of simplicity, especially since projections are an inexact science, rolling up past outside counsel spend, subtracting out estimated new filing costs might give a close estimate for prosecution costs, maybe factoring growth or reduction as appropriate. Now, as outside counsel, knowing that this is something that's complicated for in-house counsel to deal with, providing budget estimates on some sort of a regular basis, whether that's even semi-annually or quarterly, can be really helpful, especially since you're in the position of kind of control over the docket and the due dates to be able to say, okay, within the next 3 months, these things are going to hit, so therefore we're projecting this amount of cost from a prosecution perspective. Really valuable. And the last line item on here is the annuity budget line item. It's easy to simplify this to just issue patents for those of us that are focused on, say, US management. But for an international portfolio, this will undoubtedly take into account issued and pending matters. The nice thing is that these costs are very predictable out many years. If you've got the right data, an annuity provider should be able to roll all this data up for you for your portfolio so that you can see your current and future costs pretty well organized in one place. All right, so analytics is the next area, um, I like to look at analytics, at least as a budget line item, as discrete project work. Um, and the variable or consistent analytics, like say prior art searching, I like to put those into the category for the process that they support. So in the last slide, we had search under procurement because that would be a consistent piece of analysis that goes along with procurement. And an analytics line item, I like to represent the kind of ad hoc projects that will come up but are not necessarily known exactly when. So generally, like I said, these are going to pop up on an ad hoc basis, and it's going to be in line with either new product development, business line growth, competitor activity, and other things along those lines. They can be a lot less predictable than, say, new patent filings. History might be able to show approximately how many of these are needed each year, and assuming some portion is outsourced, a budget line item is going to be needed. That line item does not necessarily have to go into the detail of breaking out into specific freedom to operate or landscape or enforcement pre-litigation type of analyses. Especially if these types of things can be somewhat infrequent. Having the budget available, though, for when one or more of the circumstances in business that necessitate some kind of analysis is useful. And then tracking what kind that was so you can get an idea for trends can be helpful. Overlooking analytics as a line item is an easy way to lead to budget overruns or attempts to do more with less. Generally, the need for analytic support occurs when, well, you ought to be spending time and money on the project. That could be freedom to operate, that could clearance, money well spent to avoid much larger issues down the road is, well, money well spent. Landscape and strategic analysis, if this is done early, can help shape and inform the business plan or model. So I really recommend predetermining a budget line item for this stuff so you're not having to scrape from other areas when a need arises. And then, regarding enforcement analysis, this is one of the places where short-sighted use of analysis can be really, really costly. Now, regardless of whether you're talking about being the infringed or the alleged infringer. So, important line item. Although you don't have to go to all the details of planning out the exact uses until they come up. Okay, so when it comes to mergers and acquisitions, there are three primary parts to an M&A project, and from the perspective of IP spend. The initial analysis is done on the front end and helps drive valuation. So that's the first circle here. And then diligence, which digs into the IP to be acquired, is second. And finally, you wind up with the transfer and recordation process. And it can be easy, or it can be terribly complex and time-taking. When it comes down to, say, like fixing title issues, that can cost a lot of money. Now, I've dealt with this one personally, working on a deal where a cleaned up assignment was needed, and the inventor was not easy to, well, let's just say not easy to find. Outside help had to be hired to track down this gentleman, only to find that he was no longer even in the technology field. I think he had become a minister living in a rural part of some corner of the country. Anyway, it took a lot of additional spend just to track him down and get the signature. We got it, but that's one of the things where having the budget available to be able to cover those contingencies is helpful. Again, just like with the analytics line item, rolling these pieces into one line item and working with is helpful. And then to figure out how much, like for an upcoming year, working with the business units to get an idea of, whatever M&A activity might be on the horizon is important to allow future budgeting. Well, admin is a pretty basic category, so I think we'll be through this slide pretty quickly. You're talking about travel, memberships, subscriptions, conferences, what's needed to keep attorneys up with their CLE. A lot of this is going to ebb and flow with your headcount, but I think probably the item worth spending the most time on here is the tools, whether it's docketing systems, whether it's analytics tools, or any of the other tools that you might use in-house. These things have a set recurring cost, so they're really easy to throw on the budget. But it's worth considering, especially when you're putting new tools into the mix, how they can be leveraged to reduce costs in other areas. For example, if you're pulling in an analytics tool, does that mean less outsourced cost for analytics activities, for example? Headcount. So here's the simple way to deal with this line item. List out your staff, roll them up to a yearly cost with benefits, and call it done. There's your headcount. All right, before going on to the next slide, I did promise I'd cover the complex way to handle this. If you can allocate certain people to functions, do that here and allocate their percentages to each of the other categories. So if you've got an attorney or a patent engineer that does a lot of prior art searching or initial filing and drafting, you can allocate, some estimation of their time to those various items. I wouldn't put them up with the line items. I'd keep it in the headcount section, but categorize it under here so you get an idea of what the spend will look like. This is going to provide a more in-depth idea of what your true costs for each of the categorized activities actually are. If a person is dedicated to analytics and another to drafting, that can be useful information, especially if you're trying to, say, reduce costs or grow the department or grow the portfolio. You'll have an idea of how that will impact things, or how you can, say, turn the knobs on in-house versus external spend. It'll also be helpful to understand, say, if a person leaves or is removed, what holes will that make in the work? But also what's opened up with respect to budget in those areas that they were covering, and how can you deal with that budget and also help kind of fill those gaps. Internal marketing is an interesting one. It's fun. It can include a number of things, but the two that I found to be most important and really the most tied to spend are internal, say, invention or patent promotion, and training. So this may be creating material, delivering, especially in person, the training, and all of the costs that would be budgeted along with that. I like to budget these as, say, separate from travel up in the admin section if possible. So I get a really good idea what travel is specific to training, so I know what costs and what spend is going into training versus general travel or travel that might be used in other areas. And then the promotional material, I can recall one year on a budget, say several $100s of spend just on footballs to be used as props for patentability training. So these were toy footballs. If you can picture, especially those ones with like aerodynamic spiral shapes or tail fins, the field is ripe with patents and innovation. I didn't realize the market could even be that big, but they really do make great props for talking about a relatively dry subject. But this was an item, what you might call promotional material, that was used. It was used to drive internal training, and it was good to have a budget line item for that training, for that promotional material, so that we could have engaging content and help drive knowledge within the company with respect to IP. From an outside counsel perspective, assisting with things like this, especially the training side of things, can really help relieve a client's time or cost burden. And a lot of times there are going to be things as an outside counsel that you're exposed to that gives you that extra level of expertise where they can be leveraged to provide that training, whether that be training to an in-house core of attorneys and IP folks, or if it's training focused on, say, like an R&D team, if it's related to inventor notebooks or publications or that kind of thing, can be really helpful. Litigation. So you can't forget about litigation when it comes to budgets. Litigation is the category probably with the most potential to completely blow up a budget, especially if there's something not accounted for. It's expensive, and my advice, don't deal with it. Oh, okay, not exactly, but account for it separately from the above categories. And this applies to defense and enforcement litigation. And the budgeting really needs to be done on a case-by-case basis. The characteristics of the litigation, the timing, the costs, the venue involved, these can vary so much that it makes projections pretty much useless until you're actually into the thick of the litigation and it's been going along. Even if there's the threat and you're in negotiations, the timing and the amounts can be really difficult to predict. When it comes down, so what you want to make sure is that you have a policy in place so that when it comes down to budgeting for litigations, it's not something that has to be a predetermined line item unless it's kind of a known possibility. But also, I really highly recommend assigning the costs to the relevant business unit. Ultimately, the litigation is going to have the most direct impact on the business or product operation that it's related to. And really, the cost control, decision making, kind of the driving what the end result is going to be, regardless of whether you're on the defense or offense side, should be driven from the business side. That way, the economic, say, potential and risks can be managed and analyzed together to drive a really fully informed decision at any stage of the litigation or pre-litigation process. Similarly, licensing is not too unlike litigation in that it's best dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Of course, this discussion is with respect to a department that operates as a cost center. It's another analysis entirely if the department is treated as a P&L or a profit and loss center. That gets a little bit more complex, certainly a lot more interesting in a number of ways. And so look for an upcoming webinar addressing specifically IP departments as a profit and loss, I think I mentioned. Generally speaking though, I recommend, like litigation, not accounting for in-licensing revenue in the IP department, unless you're going to go all the way to a full P&L type management. Accounting for it tends to skew IP budgets and can really hinder management. It skews the accounting that you're going to be using above, and it can make the budget look a lot better when there's actually money coming in. The exception, is if there is truly no department to allocate licensing revenue to. So say you've got like orphaned IP, I recommend creating one, or at least a virtual department to manage that IP separately from the IP department, so they aren't viewed together. As a cost center, it's generally advised to allocate licensing cost or revenue to the business unit, again, to help keep priorities in line. When you're in licensing, costs are best accounted for by that business unit or product line that manages the products that are affected, that are kind of driving what's why this in-license cost even exists. And that additional cost should end up as part of the analysis of the affected products. It should go into the cost of those products so they can be accurately analyzed to determine whether or not their profitability looks good, what the future plans should be. And then there might be a strategy working with the IP department to either challenge the license, challenge the patents involved, and so on. But it should be driven out of the business unit. Maybe it's a low enough royalty that it's acceptable and it's worth just driving forward. From an out licensing perspective, we're talking about revenue coming in. Similarly, this should get allocated to the business product line. As much as when that's happened to me, I'd like to keep that licensing revenue in the IP department and make my numbers look great. It makes the most sense to allocate it out to the technology, based on the technology that's impacted and the products that impacts, because of the potential impact in the market. If someone's licensing the IP that's related to this particular product line, that might affect the entrance of competitors into that market. And so the business unit, that product line, really needs to be at the table and part of that discussion. At the end of the day, I think this provides a high-level overview of the general items an IP departmental budget has, and how to get those numbers organized to leverage your current budget as well as projections. The keys are understanding what goes into the buckets and tracking these things consistently. Then understanding what triggers will drive, say, the increased or decreased spend in various areas. From an outside counsel perspective, where you hold data for a lot of these items, being able to provide counts, timing, costs, these types of things can make the process much easier. Also recognizing, though, that if, for example, analysis isn't budgeted for, when analysis is needed or recommended, other items are, other line items are going to be affected. They're going to be offset in order to keep things in budget, or you're going to go over budget, and nobody wants to be in that type of scenario. So I think that brings us to the end of this webinar, and I'll open up the floor to any questions that might have come up. Oh, and I should also mention, I can't finish the webinar without putting in a plug. So I am also president of our annuities company. We have a tool that manages and pays patent annuities. As part of that, analytics are built in, and also budget forecasting is also built into the tool. If you want a demo of that tool for managing your annuities, just type "I want one" into the chat, and we will also, Justin, I think we can also, as an extra incentive, send you one of our beautiful bobbleheads.
That's right. We took a look at our free things we want to give away budget, and we created the cushion to be able to offer exactly what you just said, which is a one-of-a-kind Black Hills IP custom-made bobblehead of some of the world's innovation pioneers. We got Marie Curie, we got Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, Edison, Rosalind Franklin. The list goes on, and we've been giving these things out like hotcakes over the last month. So they're probably bobbling in offices all over the country. You don't want to be the one person in the IP space who isn't rocking a Black Hills bobblehead. Again, all you need to do is go to webinar panel, type in the chat section, "I want one." I will personally send you an email and set you up for a brief demo of our renewals and analytics platform with Tom and I. And we can actually show you some of the many ways you can use the platform to do exactly what we talked about today, which is managing a big portion of yours or your clients' IP budgets. And yeah, we'll keep the webinar open an extra minute or so. And yeah, go ahead and type that in there if you're interested. Do you have anything else today, Tom?
Well, I see one question. How useful is it to take last year's budget and just reuse it for this year? maybe with some adjustments. Well, yeah, I mean, this is a practice that's used, and it's fine if conditions are really stable. It's certainly easy. Although I will say, if portfolios are growing or shrinking, or you've got new strategies going in place, whether that be business strategies or IP strategies, the value of your prior year's data tends to diminish, maybe even down to just a data point that you might want to use in a trend at that point. So yeah, I hope that helps. If things are stable, it can work, but otherwise you need to throw a few more variables into the mix. I think there's another question about tools. What sort of tools can be used? We have a tool that's used, like I mentioned, for annuity management. As far as other tools for determining budgets, there aren't a lot of them out there. We are planning to have an upcoming in-depth webinar on a budget, like a basic budget template and calculator that we will be giving out as a basic tool to use. So keep your eyes open for that to come as an upcoming topic. All right, and with that, thanks everybody. Appreciate everybody listening to this topic on IP budgets.
Tom, I think we got one last question. I think that just popped up. They asked, what is the range for a typical IP budget? Can you provide budget ranges for a patent portfolio of X number of patents?
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky because it's going to depend how aged that portfolio is. It's going to depend a little bit on the technology area. It's going to depend on what countries you're filing in. But let's say you're filing heavily in the U.S. And let's say you file, for the purpose of making it simple, 10 patents a year, right? So in year one, let's take 10 patents. Let's assume 10,000 per patent. I know those numbers can vary up and down very easily, but we'll make the math easy. So 10 patents, 10,000 per patent for year one. So you've got 100,000 for year one. In year two, you're going to file another 10, so there's 10,000. You're probably not getting into prosecution on the patents from the first year, but you are going to hit foreign filing deadlines. Let's say you pick a couple of countries for each one at, say, an additional 5,000 or 6,000 per country per patent. So add that onto your 100,000 of the new patents. So 5,000 or 6,000 times 2, 12,000 times 10, 120,000 plus your 100,000. So year two, around 220,000. When you get into year three, some of the prosecution is going to start happening on your first year filing. So let's say 2,500 per patent from year one, plus your 120,000 for foreign filing for year two, plus your 100,000 for new filings for year three, assuming no growth year over year. And you can get a little bit of an idea at how the numbers tend to ramp up like that. Now, those filing numbers are going to differ depending on the technology and the complexity of the invention. The foreign numbers are going to differ depending on the length, translations, the countries you're going into, if you're Europe heavy versus if you're China heavy, for example. So the numbers can vary a little bit. I know I didn't give an exact direct answer, but I hope that helps a little bit. All right, what is the percentage of revenue that is typically in an IP budget for, say, like for a company like in a specialty chemical industry? That is, I'm not sure exactly. A lot of times when I see kind of the general determining what an IP budget would be, it depends. It's more tied to R&D spend than it is to total revenue. And that's because there's a big there's a big dependence on the business model of the company. You could be in a high-tech industry that does a lot of like Me Too type of things. It's more about commodity and doesn't focus a lot on new technology innovation, in which case your IP spend is not going to have to be as important, where you could have the same amount of revenue as another company in that same high-tech industry, but focuses more on highly innovative products, in which case you could have two companies with the same amount of revenue, but very differing IP budget spends, and both of those IP budgets could be very reasonable given the business model of the company. So what's better is to take a closer look at the R&D spend, because the R&D spend between the two companies is going to differ greatly, especially if we're talking about the R side of R&D. If you can even get a tighter look at the research side of things, that's where you're going to be able to see better correlations. So there is somewhat of a rule of thumb that says take 5% of R&D spend, and that gives you a pretty good idea of what your IP budget spend should be. I'm not crazy about that particular rule of thumb, and it's one that I'll talk about from time to time, what a better calculation should be. But certainly looking at R&D budget is a much more useful number to take a look at than total revenue.
Awesome. Awesome.
All right.
Well, thanks so much, Tom. And that concludes our webinar for today, and we will see you guys on the next one.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.